re, so, re, do. Every truly cultured music student knows you must learn your scales and your arpeggios.
Hello there. Today we're going to learn about scales and modes instead of scales and arpeggios. Let's go ahead and get started. So there are various scale types that have different numbers of notes in them. The ones we're most familiar with in Western music are the diatonic scales, the ones that use each of the letter names one time. So these are 7-note scales, so our major and minor scales, and all of the modes that we've learned about are 7-note scales. In addition to this, we're going to learn in this lesson about pentatonic scales, which have 5 pitches in them, whole tone scales, which have 6 notes in them, octatonic scales with 8 pitches, chromatic scales with all 12 chromatic pitches, and the blues scale. Let's start by looking at the diatonic scales. These use each one of the letter names in our system. So they're 7-note scales, and they're different in their positioning of the whole and half steps. So for example, in C Ionian, which we also know as major, we have half step between E and F, between B and C. Sounds like this. Whereas if we were a Mixolydian mode and started on, these are just the white key versions of these modes, if we start on G, the half step is still in between E and F and between B and C, but that happens in a different place in the scale. And so on with the other modes here. Locrian of these, Locrian is not very useful and historically not important. But Aeolian is our natural minor, and the other modes are used fairly frequently in 20th century music as well as in earlier music. So the chart we were just looking at only included the white key modes, but we can transpose the modes to begin on any pitch, and one easy way to do this is to think of them in relation to major and minor scales. Now, of course, the Ionian mode is identical to the major scale, and the Aeolian mode is the same as a natural minor scale, so we can easily think of those modes in those terms. The Lydian mode is a major scale with a raised 4, so I could take a D major scale and raise scale degree 4, and I'd have D Lydian. Similarly, I could take that D major scale and lower scale degree 7 and have D Mixolydian. The other modes are based on minor, so the Dorian mode is like a minor scale with a raised 6. So I could take, for example, G minor and raise scale degree 6 and have G Dorian. Lastly, I could take that G minor scale and lower scale degree 2, and I'd have G Phrygian. So it's fairly easy to think of the modes in relation to the scales in this way. Now let's look at pentatonic scales. These are of course 5-note scales, and they're common in many cultures throughout the world. The major pentatonic scale can be thought of as scale degrees 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6 from a major scale, so just leaving out scale degrees 4 and 7. As we see in this first example, leaving out the F and the B in this scale leaves out the tritone and also the 2 half steps that occur in a major scale. So this just retains all of the consonant parts of the major scale, leaving out those dissonances. One form of the minor pentatonic scale uses these same scale degrees in minor, as you see in the second example. And that retains both of the half steps that are characteristic of the minor scales, flat 3 and flat 6. Another form of the minor pentatonic scale is to rotate the major pentatonic scale, starting on its scale degree 6. So we take this same major pentatonic scale on C, and then go to scale degree 6 and use the same pitches. That's another very common form of minor pentatonic. And those two, of course, are very closely related. Just depends on the pitch that you emphasize melodically. So these, of course, pentatonic scales can be transposed to begin on any pitch using the same basic structure. Whole tone scales only use whole steps. There are no half steps. So this is a symmetrical scale, meaning that it has the same structure moving from the left to the right as it would from the right to the left. I have whole steps going this way and whole steps going the other way. These are 6-note scales, so there's always going to be a visual gap on the staff. In this case, I've written it with G sharp, A sharp, C at the end, but I could have written it as A flat, B flat, C. No matter how it's spelled, though, there's always going to be a missing letter. There's only 2 possible whole tone collections. The others are all going to be rotations of these 2 scales that you see here. So I have a whole tone collection that starts on C. And if I were to start on D, it would be the same whole tone collection, just rotated. Okay, the other collection starts on B, or any of the other pitches there, I guess, in that collection. So if it starts on B, we have... Those are all different pitches than the first scale. We have 6 pitches in the first collection and 6 in the other collection, and that gives us all 12 chromatic pitches. Okay, so you can refer to those as whole tone collection 1 or whole tone collection 2. Another symmetrical scale is the octatonic scale. This one uses a pattern that alternates between whole steps and half steps. This results in 8 pitches in the scale, so one of the letter names is always going to be used twice. You can see in the first example here that I've used an F and an F sharp. And so the structure is whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step. One of the forms of the octatonic starts like this, with the whole step. Another form would start with a half step. So here's the second example starting on D. Half, whole, half, whole, half, whole, half, whole. Now I chose this version of the octatonic scale starting on D to show how the second scale here is a rotation of the first scale. If I were to start on D in this first structure, it would be the same pitches as the second one. If we were to investigate this further, we would see that there are only 3 possible octatonic collections. The collection that starts on C, the one that starts on C sharp, and the one that starts on D. Another symmetrical scale is the chromatic scale, which uses only half steps. That results in a scale with all 12 chromatic pitches. And there's various ways of spelling chromatic scales, but it is common to show the direction by using sharps on the way up and flats on the way down to show direction. So here's an ascending chromatic scale and descending. Composers started using all 12 chromatic pitches equally in the early 20th century, and so it's not just alterations of a major or a minor scale, but using all of them in a equal way. The last scale that we're going to be looking at in this lesson is the blues scale. This is a collection of pitches that is often used by blues musicians in improvisation. There are some variants, but the traditional collection uses scale degrees 1, flat 3, 4, sharp 4, 5, and flat 7. So those are pitches that a blues musician might select from. There are a lot of other scales throughout the world, including microtonal scales, which use intervals smaller than a half step. If you want to see the complete list of scale types, look at on Wikipedia a list of scales. And that'll do it for the lesson today. Make sure to take the quiz that follows.